exactly are you researching at the moment in regard to your academic affairs presentation?
Okay, so I've had this long-standing interest in decentralization in authoritarian government. So a lot of times when we think about authoritarian regimes, we think a lot about the person of the dictator. So think about Saddam Hussein, or you think about Kim Jong-un, and there's kind of an expectation that power is really concentrated in the person of the leader. And so when I went to Peace Corps in China, which is right out of my master's program in my early 20s, I went over there, and I was came with some of those expectations that power is really concentrated in the national leadership, and that power is really monolithic. So, what really matters is the arbitrary beliefs and ideas of the great leader. And so, one of the things I was really surprised by in China was just how dynamic the state is, because you have the national government that has its own directives and its own ideas about how policy should happen. But then China's this monster country with 37 provinces, with all of these counties and prefectures and municipalities below it. And one of the things I was really interested in was just the fact that these lower level officials have a lot of their own power and responsibility. And so policy is implemented very differently, right? And that's kind of how decentralization is both a kind of a blessing and a curse for China, because you have local officials who have all this flexibility to determine policies in their in their own areas. And China's so diverse economically in terms of ethnicity and local cultures and geographic placement. All of these things are different and can affect which policies will work. So there's no one size fits all for all Chinese provinces. And so local officials end up being kind of entrepreneurial. They come up with policies that'll work in one particular place. But, as we talked about in the presentation, there's also risk involved. Like, there's so many layers of government, and there's so many, there's so much money flowing around, and there's so much flexibility in local governments that, like, if I can control my own budget as a local official, I get to determine how much is spent on schools, for example, and I also would be the person in charge of actually implementing construction. So if I want to hide some money, so say I want to spend less money on like steel scaffolding in a in a building, and just build it in concrete, then I'm the one who's going to be checking out whether or not I'm the one who's actually going to be building the building, and a lot of times I'll be in charge of who's inspecting to ensure that I'm spending the money in that way. So it's very easy for me to just like sell the steel bars on the side instead of putting them in the school and putting it in my pocket, right? And then also corruption works with development, because I can bribe people to come into my district and invest. And so I'm encouraging more people to invest through corruption. So decentralization is really interesting. It's both it helps explain China's economic miracle, but it also explains like why China is both this growing powerful economy, but also can't deal with the persistent problem of corruption. The other line of research that connects to this is called paradiplomacy. So is foreign policy just the domain of the national government, or is it delegated to other actors, national, state-owned corporations, or provincial state-owned corporations, or the provinces themselves. And so this most recent project was I was looking at Yunnan province, which straddles Myanmar and Vietnam and Laos, and has positioned itself to be what they call the bridge, that connects China's growing economy to the untapped markets of Southeast Asia. And that's kind of the program that this particular governor I'm interested in, Bai Pai, marketed his province as. But as you saw in the presentation, he was very successful in promoting growth and in bringing Yunnan out of kind of obscurity as an economic or as a market. And he was also taking a lot of money on the side, about $37 million, and was implicated in this big anti-corruption campaign. So I'm interested in how those two things intersect, decentralization, paradiplomacy, and how it all plays out in a non-elected, authoritarian government.
Why are you researching this topic? What exactly has inspired you to research kind of the decentralization within the Yunnan province and sort of this intrigue into Chinese government and how it plays out and how it works?
Yeah, so I didn't really study China until I finished my master's at U of L and then joined the Peace Corps, and I was sent to, or my wife and I served together in Chongqing Municipality, which is this huge city in China's interior, and it claims as many as 30 million people. So it's very big. Yeah. And I was really interested in decentralization because when I was there, Chongqing had this really famous mayor, and his name was Bo Xilai. And Bo Xilai is, he was a guy that was a lot more colorful than you usually think of Chinese officials as being. And so he was really creative in terms of marketing Chongqing as a destination for investment, and also getting people really excited about development programs. And so he even had campaigns that were things like Sing Red Songs campaigns, which harkens back to China's Maoist period, and planting trees across Chongqing, and bringing in German engineers to build this light rail system. And when incidents would break out, like right after I left Chongqing, there was a big taxi strike. So they have all these taxis where they run on natural gas, and there were all these grievances about about the cost of natural gas fueling stations and the competition from unlicensed taxi drivers. And anyway, they shut down the whole city by all refusing to go to work. And Bo Xilai was famously had these meetings and negotiations with the taxi driver strike leaders, and live streamed them on TV, which was really novel and different. And people were like, oh, he's really listening to us. He's letting us speak our minds, and then he's being responsive. And so some of my first research that I did as a PhD student was talking about Bo Xilai. And Bo Xilai, in my early writings, was really focused on as this like innovative local official who was really good at promoting development. And he was also apparently a mover and shaker in the Chinese Communist Party, and had aspirations to be, if not the national leader, to be on the Politburo and at the very top of the government. And corruption came into play with him because he was connected to this Englishman named Neil Haywood, and his wife and him were connected to him. And Neil Haywood ended up getting murdered. He was poisoned in a hotel room in Chongqing, and this all came out when his security chief in Chongqing showed up at the American consulate in Chengdu, apparently quite frightened that Bo Xilai's security detail was going to catch him. and so he went into the American consulate and didn't want to be turned over to the Bo Xilai's security details, and eventually the national government intervened, and it led to a big scandal, and Bo Xilai was eventually convicted on corruption charges along with his wife, and they were implicated in the murder of this guy Neil Haywood, this English go-between guy that was in China, and so that kind of brought me to this this place where it's really interesting, where many people like Bo Xilai would be really strong visionary leaders, and they would use that autonomy and that independence for development, for determining development policy. But then a lot of times, they would use their power for nefarious things and self-enrichment. And in the last few years, Xi Jinping, the national leader, has engaged in a massive anti-corruption campaign and arrested or investigated over 200,000 officials. And Bo Xilai was one of the first people to start that movement. And so, kind of my personal experience just living in Chongqing for 2 years really made me aware of how important local officials are, and how they're not just like appendages of the central government, and that they a lot of times have their own interests and their own activities. And sometimes when things happen in China, it's not because it's at the order of the central government. It's often because the central government doesn't know about it, right? Or they're looking the other way, and they're biding their time to kind of intervene. But just kind of living in a place and talking to people from that, that part of the country, where, by the way, they still think Bo Xilai is great. It was this great leader, even though he's in jail now. Makes you, it kind of shows you how China is just so much more complicated. But the experience of living there really gave me kind of a passion for explaining all of these differences that occur within China.
Well, it's great to see someone so passionate about something and willing to go so far to study it. And that's what I am curious. How long exactly have you been researching this topic, and how long has it taken you to compile all the research that was really presented in your academic affairs talk?
Okay, yeah. In terms of that specific article, I would say it's a little complicated, because in terms of just writing it, that was my big project last fall semester. So that would be fall 2017, and that was when I was doing most of the writing. But it built on a lot of the research that I've done previously, where you're doing a lot of the theoretical work in looking at all the different research that's out there and bringing it all together. I also did some field work in Taiwan in 2015, and visited a lot of different think tanks, and got to speak to with the China specialists, as they call them in Taiwan. So that was a really good experience, where I got exposure to some of these local politics in various parts of the country. And Yunnan was one that came up on occasion, because they came up with this bridgehead policy that later influenced the One Belt, One Road initiative, which is a big flagship national policy under Xi Jinping. But a lot of those scholars in Taiwan talked a lot about much of these local politics, and so that gave me some of the idea for the research. And then Yunnan is also a place that I've been to a couple times. It's this gorgeous province where it's always about 60 to 70 degrees. It's always springtime weather, and because it straddles Myanmar and Laos, and it is so influenced by Thai culture. It's got this really unique cuisine, and it's got these it touches part of it is in the Himalayas, and part of it is lowlands, and kind of these subtropical jungles, and there's elephants, and there's monkeys all over the place, and there's just kind of a lot of really interesting kind of biodiversity and geographic features, and then it's really a lot of ethnic diversity. And so I was really particularly interested in this place just because it's such a wonderful place to visit, and because I've been there a couple times, I was very interested just in how they'd taken this place that was so far away from the Chinese coast, and it had become it had developed so much over the years. And so Yunnan was of particular interest to me. And last fall, I spent a lot of time going through archival materials, so publications from the local government, publications from the national government. There are databases that are derived from media accounts that track all of the development projects that are funded by Chinese money, and I followed up that database to give me kind of a picture of how much involvement is going on both in Yunnan but across the border into Myanmar and Laos and Vietnam and even in Cambodia, and then in the data set you also have information about what companies were involved. And so I was kind of tracking the origin of all these different companies to seeing where the development projects went. So I was really interested not just in how Yunnan was developing within, but how it was expanding its influence and investing outward into neighboring countries. And so it's kind of like you're drawing connections between the development project and the company that's doing it, and then you're looking at who is who's in charge of the company and what Chinese cities it connected into. And one of the things I was really interested in was that Bai Pei, the leader of Yunnan, his wife was in charge of this major hydropower project in Myanmar. Mm-hmm. And interestingly, the both of them ended up being implicated in the anti-corruption campaign. And they, and I mentioned this in the presentation. I thought this was really interesting, but they had this kind of profile of them in on Chinese media where they were it was like lifestyles of the rich and corrupt, pretty much, and they were going through their mansions and showing how they were spending their money and all their clothes and and cars and stuff, and talking about what kind of corruption they'd been involved with. But basically just getting into kind of the archival material that's available and then connecting it to some of these data sets, I was able to put together this case study of how Yunnan developed and how it led to both development and economic growth, but also create an opportunity for corruption to break out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One final question, just because everybody at Transy, I'm sure, is wondering. How do you keep your skin just so flawless? Do you have a skincare routine that you'd like to talk with us about, or
My skincare routine? Yeah, just bar soap and water, and no, I don't.
Gotta keep that youthful.
I do not have any really useful skincare recommendations.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that was disappointing, but thank you very much for meeting with us. It was great to talk with you, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.